Okay, so picture this. You're Donald Trump. Your entire economic agenda depends on tariffs, your signature policy, your main tool for reshaping trade, your proof that you're being tough on China and other countries, and the Supreme Court is holding oral arguments about whether your tariffs are legal. You're watching, maybe on TV, maybe getting updates from your lawyers, and what you see is a disaster. Justices are grilling your lawyers, not just the liberal justices, the conservative ones too. Chief Justice Roberts is questioning whether you've trampled congressional authority. Justice Kavanaugh, your own appointee, is asking if your tariffs are really just taxes that only Congress can impose. Justice Gorsuch, another one of your appointees, is pushing your lawyers on constitutional limits. And your lawyers are struggling. They can't give satisfying answers. They're trying to argue you have broad emergency powers, that presidents need flexibility on trade, that national security requires this authority. But justices aren't buying it. They're pointing out that Congress has the constitutional power to regulate commerce, that tariffs have always been congressional prerogative, that what you're doing looks like a presidential power grab. And the hearing goes on for nearly 3 hours. 3 hours of justices from across the ideological spectrum expressing skepticism about your legal position. 3 hours of your lawyers getting hammered with tough questions they can't adequately answer. 3 hours broadcast to the entire country, showing everyone that the Supreme Court thinks you probably exceeded your authority. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video. This is wild. This is absolutely devastating for Trump, because oral arguments matter, not just for the legal outcome, but for public perception. When justices spend 3 hours questioning your position, when they openly express doubt about your authority, that sends a message to the public, to Congress, to future presidents, that what Trump did was probably illegal, that the court is likely to rule against him, that Trump's claims of unlimited presidential power are being rejected. So let's talk about it. Let's break down what happened at oral arguments, what the justices said, why Trump's lawyers struggle, and what this public smackdown means for Trump's tariffs and his presidency. Because trust me, this is huge. This is the Supreme Court publicly questioning Trump's authority. This is justices signaling they're going to rule against him. And this is Trump facing the prospect of his signature economic policy being declared unconstitutional. Now, the oral arguments happened on November 5th, 2025. The case challenges Trump's use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose sweeping tariffs. Trump declared that trade imbalances with various countries constituted national emergencies, and he used emergency powers to impose tariffs without congressional approval. But challengers, including states and businesses, argued Trump exceeded his authority, that IEEPA doesn't give presidents unlimited power to impose tariffs, that Trump's national security justifications are pretextual, that this is really about trade policy, which requires congressional action. So the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case, and the oral arguments revealed deep skepticism about Trump's position. Chief Justice Roberts made a key point early. He said the power to levy tariffs has always been the core power of Congress. That's constitutionally significant. The Constitution explicitly gives Congress power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and tariffs are a form of commerce regulation. So if tariffs have always been congressional power, what authority does Trump have to impose them unilaterally? Trump's lawyers tried to argue Congress delegated authority to presidents through IEEPA and other statutes. But Roberts questioned whether that delegation was meant to be so broad, whether Congress intended to give presidents unlimited tariff authority, and Trump's lawyers couldn't point to clear congressional intent for such broad delegation. Justice Kavanaugh raised the tax issue. He pointed out that tariffs are effectively taxes. They raise revenue for the government by taxing imports, and the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the power to tax. So if Trump's tariffs are taxes, doesn't that mean only Congress can impose them? Trump's lawyers tried to argue tariffs aren't really taxes, that they're trade regulations or national security measures. But Kavanaugh pushed back, said that regardless of what you call them, tariffs function as taxes. They raise government revenue by imposing charges on imports, and that makes them subject to constitutional limits on taxation. Justice Gorsuch questioned limits on presidential power. He asked Trump's lawyers, if the president can declare trade imbalances, national emergencies, and impose tariffs, what else can presidents do? Could they declare climate change an emergency and impose carbon taxes? Could they declare healthcare costs an emergency and regulate insurance? Where are the boundaries? And Trump's lawyers struggled to articulate clear limits. They essentially argued that presidents have broad discretion to determine what constitutes emergencies, that courts should defer to presidential judgment. But Gorsuch seemed troubled by that, seemed to think it would give presidents nearly unlimited power, that it would undermine separation of powers and congressional authority. Even Justice Barrett, another Trump appointee, expressed concerns. She questioned whether Trump's justifications for the tariffs were genuine national security concerns or just economic policy preferences dressed up as emergencies. And she pushed Trump's lawyers to explain the distinction, but they couldn't give a clear answer. Liberal justices like Sotomayor and Kagan were even more aggressive. They directly challenged Trump's lawyers, suggested the tariffs were obviously illegal, that Trump was clearly exceeding his authority, that the case was straightforward. So across the ideological spectrum, justices expressed skepticism. From the liberal wing to the conservative wing, nobody seemed fully convinced by Trump's position, and that's devastating, because it suggests the court is likely to rule against Trump, maybe not unanimously, but probably with a strong majority. Now, the hearing lasted nearly 3 hours. That's unusually long, and it shows the court takes this case seriously, that they're grappling with fundamental questions about presidential power and separation of powers. Throughout the hearing, Trump's lawyers were on the defensive. They couldn't articulate clear principles that would limit presidential power while still authorizing Trump's tariffs. They couldn't distinguish Trump's emergency declarations from hypothetical abuses of power. They couldn't explain why courts should defer to Trump's judgment when his national security justifications seemed pretextual. And justices noticed, they commented on the inadequacy of Trump's lawyers' answers. They expressed frustration with the lack of clear limiting principles. They made clear they weren't satisfied with Trump's legal arguments. So by the end of the hearing, observers universally agreed Trump is in trouble. The court is skeptical. A ruling against Trump seems likely, and that would be a massive blow to Trump's presidency and legacy. So yeah, this is the story. Supreme Court smacking down Trump at a public hearing. Justices across the ideological spectrum grilling Trump's lawyers, expressing deep skepticism about Trump's tariff authority, signaling that a ruling against Trump is coming. Let's break it down. All right, so let's dig into the legal issues and why the Supreme Court skepticism is so significant. Because this case is about more than just tariffs. It's about the scope of presidential power and the constitutional structure. Let's start with the constitutional framework. The Constitution gives Congress power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. That's explicit in Article 1. It also gives Congress power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. Tariffs fall under both categories. They regulate foreign commerce, and they're a form of tax on imports. So constitutionally, tariffs are congressional prerogative. Presidents don't have inherent constitutional power to impose tariffs. Any presidential tariff authority must come from congressional delegation, from statutes that give presidents limited authority to impose tariffs in specific circumstances. Now, Trump relied on two main statutory authorities for his tariffs. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, passed in 1977. This allows presidents to regulate international transactions during national emergencies, but it requires a genuine emergency, a serious threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economy. And it requires the president to declare the emergency formally and explain why it exists. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, this allows presidents to adjust imports if they threaten national security. But again, it requires a genuine national security threat, not just economic concerns. So both statutes delegate limited authority to presidents, but the key word is limited. Congress didn't give presidents unlimited power to impose any tariffs they want. The authority is constrained by the requirement of genuine emergencies or national security threats. Now, Trump's use of these authorities has been controversial. Trump declared that trade imbalances constitute national emergencies, that buying more from other countries than we sell to them threatens national security. But many experts, including former government officials and economists, say that's not true. Trade imbalances aren't emergencies. They're normal features of global trade. Countries run trade deficits and surpluses all the time without it constituting emergencies. And the U.S. has run trade deficits for decades without national security being threatened. So Trump's emergency declarations seem pretextual. They seem like excuses to impose tariffs for economic policy reasons rather than genuine emergencies. And that's important legally, because if Trump's emergency declarations aren't genuine and he doesn't have statutory authority to impose tariffs, he's exceeded the power Congress gave him. Now, lower courts have already ruled on this. Multiple federal courts found Trump's tariffs exceeded his statutory authority, that his emergency justifications don't meet the legal requirements, that his tariffs are unlawful, and those courts ordered Trump to stop collecting the tariffs and to refund money already collected. That's why the case is at the Supreme Court. Trump appealed the lower court rulings, and the court agreed to hear the case because it raises fundamental questions about presidential power. Now, at oral arguments, the justices explored several key issues: congressional delegation and its limits, Justices question how much authority Congress can delegate to presidents. Can Congress give presidents nearly unlimited power over an entire policy area like trade, or must delegations be more limited? And if there are limits, what are they? Trump's lawyers argue Congress can delegate broadly, that presidents need flexibility to respond to changing circumstances, that IEEPA in Section 232 give presidents wide discretion. But justices seem troubled by that, seem to think unlimited delegation would violate separation of powers, would effectively allow Congress to give away its constitutional powers. The major questions doctrine. This is a developing legal principle. It says that for questions of major economic and political significance, courts shouldn't assume Congress delegated authority to agencies or presidents unless Congress clearly says so. And tariffs that affect billions of dollars in trade and impact the entire economy are certainly major questions. So several justices suggested the major questions doctrine applies here, that even if IEPA seems to give broad authority, courts should interpret it narrowly when it comes to sweeping tariffs. That Congress needs to speak clearly if it wants to authorize such significant presidential action. Real emergencies versus pretextual emergencies. Justices probe whether Trump's declared emergencies are genuine, whether trade imbalances really threaten national security, whether presidents can declare anything they want an emergency. And justices seem skeptical of Trump's justifications, seem to think trade imbalances aren't real emergencies, that Trump is abusing emergency powers to implement policies he couldn't get through Congress. Tariffs as taxes. Several justices explored whether tariffs are really taxes, and if so, whether only Congress can impose them under the Constitution's tax power. Trump's lawyers tried to distinguish tariffs from taxes, but justices weren't convinced. They noted tariffs raise revenue. They function economically like taxes. And if they're taxes, presidential imposition of them is constitutionally problematic. Separation of powers and checks on presidential power. Justices repeatedly came back to separation of powers, to the idea that the Constitution divides power among branches, that Congress has certain powers, presidents have others, and that courts must enforce those boundaries. If presidents can impose sweeping tariffs unilaterally, what's left of Congress's commerce power? How does separation of powers work if presidents can take over entire policy areas? Justices seem concerned that ruling for Trump would upset the constitutional balance, would give future presidents too much power, would undermine congressional authority. Now Trump's lawyers try several arguments in response. They emphasize national security deference, argued that courts should defer to presidential judgments about national security, that presidents have expertise and access to intelligence that courts don't, that judicial review of national security decisions should be minimal. But justices pushed back, said that deference has limits, that presidents can't just invoke national security to do whatever they want, that there must be some actual national security justification, not just claims. They argued Congress intended broad delegation, said that when Congress passed IEEPA in Section 232, it meant to give presidents significant flexibility, that the statutory language is broad, that Congress could have imposed more restrictions but didn't. But justices questioned that interpretation, asked where the limits are if the statutes are as broad as Trump claims, suggested that interpreting the statutes more narrowly is necessary to avoid constitutional problems. They warned about economic harm from striking down tariffs, said that billions of dollars in tariffs have been collected, that businesses have structured deals around existing tariffs, that striking them down would create economic chaos. But justices didn't seem moved by this. They noted that if tariffs are illegal, economic disruption from correcting the illegality isn't a reason to keep them, that rule of law matters more than economic convenience. They cited precedent supporting presidential power, pointed to past cases where courts upheld broad presidential authority over foreign affairs and trade, but justices distinguished those cases, said they involved different statutes, different circumstances, or different levels of presidential action, that precedent supporting some presidential power doesn't mean unlimited presidential power. So Trump's lawyers' arguments largely failed to persuade. Justices found holes in the reasoning, found the positions too extreme, found the claim limits on presidential power too vague. Now let's talk about what the public nature of this hearing means. Supreme Court oral arguments are public. They're recorded and transcribed. Media covers them extensively, and this hearing was particularly high profile because it involves a former president's signature policy, because it raises fundamental constitutional questions, because billions of dollars in international trade are at stake. So millions of people heard about this hearing, heard that justices expressed skepticism about Trump's tariffs, heard that even conservative justices question Trump's authority, and that shapes public opinion, makes people think Trump probably exceeded his power, makes Trump's claims of authority less credible. The public skepticism also affects Trump politically, shows he's not the strongman he claims, shows the Supreme Court, including justices he appointed, think he might have broken the law. That's politically damaging. undermines Trump's brand. The hearing creates pressure for a decision. With the court publicly expressing so much skepticism, there's pressure to follow through, to rule against Trump, because if they expressed all this doubt and then ruled for Trump anyway, it would seem inconsistent. So the public hearing makes a ruling against Trump more likely. The hearing educates the public about separation of powers. Many Americans don't think deeply about constitutional structure, but this case highlights why it matters. Why Congress having power over tariffs matters. Why presidential overreach is dangerous, and that civic education is valuable. The hearing shows courts are willing to check presidents, even powerful presidents like Trump, even on issues they claim are about national security. Courts will enforce constitutional and statutory limits, and that's essential for democracy. So the public hearing served multiple functions. It allowed justices to probe the legal issues. It signaled how the court is likely to rule. It shaped public opinion. It educated citizens about constitutional principles, and it demonstrated judicial independence. So yeah, this is where we are. Supreme Court justices, across ideological lines, expressing deep skepticism about Trump's tariffs, questioning his authority, challenging his lawyers' arguments, and signaling that a ruling against Trump is coming. Let's talk about the likely outcome and its implications. Okay, so let's break down what happens if the Supreme Court rules against Trump on tariffs. Because based on the oral arguments, that seems likely, and the consequences would be enormous. First, let's talk about the immediate legal consequences. Trump's tariffs would be declared unlawful. The court would rule Trump exceeded his statutory authority, that his tariffs violate the law, that they must be stopped. Trump would have to stop collecting tariffs immediately. No more tariffs imposed under the struck-down authorities. That's billions of dollars in annual revenue that stops coming in. Companies would be entitled to refunds. Businesses that pay tariffs under now illegal authorities could demand their money back. The government would have to return potentially billions of dollars. That creates massive administrative and budgetary problems. Lower court rulings would be affirmed. The court would be validating what lower courts already said, that Trump's actions were illegal, that courts were right to block them. Future presidential use of emergency powers would be constrained. The court's ruling would establish that presidents can't use emergency authorities as broadly as Trump tried, that genuine emergencies are required, that courts will enforce limits. Congress's authority would be reaffirmed. The court would be saying that tariffs are congressional prerogative, that presidents need clear authorization, that separation of powers matters. So legally, a ruling against Trump would have sweeping effects, not just on Trump's tariffs, but on presidential power generally. Second, let's talk about economic consequences. Trade policy would be thrown into chaos temporarily. With existing tariffs struck down, businesses wouldn't know what rules apply, what their costs are, what prices to charge. That uncertainty is economically harmful. Some industries would benefit. Industries that were harmed by Trump's tariffs would see costs drop, would become more competitive, would potentially create jobs. Other industries might suffer. Industries that benefited from tariffs, protecting them from competition, would face new challenges, might lose jobs, might struggle. Consumer prices might drop. If tariffs are removed, imported goods become cheaper. That saves consumers money, but it might hurt domestic producers. The federal budget would face a shortfall. Tariff revenue would disappear. Refunds would have to be paid. That creates budgetary pressure to either cut spending or raise other taxes. International trade relations would shift. Other countries will respond to the removal of U.S. tariffs, might negotiate new trade agreements, might adjust their own policies, creates instability in global trade. Congress might need to act. If Trump's tariffs are struck down, Congress might need to pass legislation on trade policy to fill the gap left by the court's ruling. But whether Congress can agree on trade policy is uncertain. So economically, the effects will be mixed and complex. Some winners, some losers, but overall, significant disruption while the country adjusts. Third, let's talk about political consequences for Trump. Trump's signature policy would be declared illegal. His main economic accomplishment struck down. That's devastating for his legacy. Trump's claims of expertise would be undermined. He's positioned himself as a brilliant deal maker, an expert on trade. But if the Supreme Court says his trade policy was illegal, that reputation is destroyed. Trump would be humiliated, publicly. The Supreme Court, including justices he appointed, ruling against him. That's personal humiliation. Trump's influence over Republicans would weaken further. If Trump's policies are being struck down by courts, why should Republicans follow him? His failed legal strategies make him look like a poor leader. Trump's 2026 prospects would deteriorate. Running for office with your signature policy having been declared illegal is bad. Gives opponents ammunition, makes persuading moderate voters harder. Trump's legal troubles would compound. If courts are willing to rule against Trump on tariffs, they might be willing to rule against him on other issues too. His other legal battles become harder to win. So politically, a Supreme Court ruling against Trump would be devastating, would undermine his power, his credibility, and his political future. Fourth, let's talk about implications for presidential power generally. Future presidents will be more constrained. They couldn't use emergency powers as broadly as Trump tried, would need genuine emergencies, would face judicial scrutiny. Congress will be empowered. Congress's constitutional role in trade and taxation would be reaffirmed. Congress might be emboldened to reassert itself in other areas too. Separation of powers would be strengthened. The court would be enforcing constitutional boundaries, preventing one branch from taking power that belongs to another. Emergency powers would be reformed. Congress might revise emergency power statutes, impose clearer limits, create more oversight mechanisms to prevent future abuses. Judicial review would be affirmed. The court would be showing that presidential actions are subject to judicial review, that courts will strike down presidential overreach, that rule of law applies even to presidents. So the ruling would have implications far beyond Trump, would affect how future presidents govern, how Congress and courts interact with presidents, how our constitutional system functions. Fifth, let's talk about what Trump does if he loses. Trump will rage publicly, will attack the court, claim the justices are biased or corrupt, will say the ruling is politically motivated. Trump's base will believe him, will think Trump is being persecuted, that the courts are part of the deep state that undermines institutional legitimacy. Trump might defy the ruling, might try to continue collecting tariffs despite the court saying it's illegal. That would create a constitutional crisis. Trump will demand Congress act, will tell them to pass legislation authorizing tariffs, but Congress might not comply. Democrats will resist. Some Republicans might too. Trump will try to find workarounds, other legal authorities to impose tariffs, new justifications, new approaches, but courts will scrutinize those too. Trump will fundraise off the ruling, will tell supporters he's being attacked, that he needs their help, will use the ruling to energize his base and raise money. So Trump's response will be defiant and chaotic, will create more problems even as he tries to respond to this one. 6. Let's talk about what this means for democracy. Courts prove they can check presidents, even powerful ones, even on issues presidents claim are vital. That's essential for constitutional government, but it also creates backlash. Trump and his supporters attack courts, undermine faith in judiciary, create division about whether judicial review is legitimate. The system is tested. Constitutional crisis is possible if Trump defies the ruling. But if institutions hold, if Trump ultimately complies, that strengthens the system, shows it can survive stress tests. Citizens learn about civics. The case educates people about separation of powers, about why constitutional limits matter, about how courts protect democracy, and that education is valuable for civic health. The precedent affects future presidencies, establishes that courts will enforce limits on presidential power, that presidents can't exceed statutory or constitutional authority, that shapes how future presidents govern. So what's the bottom line? The Supreme Court held oral arguments on Trump's tariffs, and justices across the ideological spectrum expressed deep skepticism. Chief Justice Roberts questioned whether Trump trampled congressional authority. Conservative justices like Kavanaugh and Gorsuch pressed Trump's lawyers on limits to presidential power. Liberal justices directly challenged the legality of Trump's actions. Trump's lawyers struggled to answer, couldn't articulate clear limiting principles, couldn't justify Trump's broad claims of authority. The 3-hour hearing was a public smackdown. Everyone saw justices questioning Trump's authority. Everyone heard the skepticism. That shapes public opinion and signals how the court will likely rule. Based on the oral arguments, Trump is likely to lose. The court seems poised to rule that Trump exceeded his authority, that his tariffs are unlawful, that they must be struck down. The consequences would be enormous. Tariffs stopped. Refunds required. Presidential power constrained. Trump's legacy damaged. His political standing weakened. But also separation of powers strengthened. Congressional authority reaffirmed. And the rule of law upheld. This case matters not just for Trump, but for American democracy, for how our constitutional system functions, for whether courts can check presidential overreach. And based on the public hearing, the answer seems to be yes. Courts can and will check presidents who exceed their authority, even former presidents with devoted followings, even on issues claimed to be vital to national security. The law matters, the Constitution matters, and the Supreme Court will enforce both. That's the message from the oral arguments. That's what the public smackdown of Trump revealed, and that's what the eventual ruling will likely confirm. Stay tuned, because the Supreme Court's decision is coming, and it will likely deal Trump a massive defeat, will strike down his tariffs, will constrain presidential power, will reaffirm constitutional principles. The oral argument showed where the court is heading, and Trump should be worried because his signature policy is about to be declared illegal by the very court he thought would protect him.